There is a particular quiet that settles over archives after dark. It is a silence different from that of an empty room. It is heavy, filled with the latent weight of countless moments pressed into clay and paper. Here, under the low, focused light, the air is still and cool, tasting faintly of dust and preservation chemicals. We are not in a library of stories, but in a vault of administration, a repository of the mundane transactions that formed the bedrock of the world's first cities. Yet, within these stacks of carefully catalogued fragments, among the receipts for grain and the records of land sales, lies a different kind of accounting. It is a ledger of time itself, an inventory of humanity's origin, recorded with a bureaucratic coolness that is, perhaps, the most unsettling thing about it. The journey begins here, not with a thunderous revelation, but with the quiet turning of a page, or in this case, the careful handling of a fire-hardened tablet that has held its silence for 5,000 years. Consider the object itself. It is not a grand monument or a gilded scroll, but a simple block of clay, small enough to fit in the palm of a hand. It is dense, cool to the touch, its surface covered in a dense constellation of wedge-shaped marks. Each impression is a testament to a deliberate act, a stylus pressed into wet clay by a hand that has long since turned to dust. This tablet was unearthed from the layered earth of what was once southern Iraq, a shard of a forgotten world pulled from the rubble of a temple or a scribal school. It has survived the fall of empires, the shifting of riverbeds, and the slow grind of millennia. Now it rests in a climate-controlled case, stripped of its context of sun and soil, becoming a pure artifact of information. Its physical presence is a constant reminder that this is not an abstract myth. It is a message, a piece of data that has completed an impossible journey from its time to ours, waiting patiently to be read. This particular tablet is known as the Sumerian King List. Its function, at first glance, appears straightforward and administrative. It is a document of succession, a linear record of rulers, the cities from which they reigned, and the duration of their rule. It reads like a meticulous piece of state bookkeeping, intended to establish a continuous and legitimate line of authority from the distant past to the present day of the scribe. The entries are formulaic, repetitive. After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. In Eridu, Alulim became king. He ruled for 800 years. The next king, Alalangar, ruled for 36 Zuriu-Eru years. The list continues in this manner, city by city, king by king, with a dispassionate precision that gives no indication that these figures are anything but factual data points, entered into the official record by a diligent civil servant at the dawn of history. The mind struggles to find a place for such information. It is not the scale of the numbers themselves that creates the disturbance, but their placement within such a rigid, administrative framework. This is not poetry. There are no epic flourishes, no metaphorical language to soften the claim. The scribe does not present these reigns as symbolic or divine. He records them with the same detached neutrality he would use for a tally of temple livestock or a measurement of a canal's length. The document structure insists on being read as a historical account, a simple list of facts. This creates a quiet, intellectual dissonance. We are looking at a primary source document from the very beginning of writing that presents, as its foundational premise, a history that is utterly incompatible with our own. The record is clear and unambiguous. It is our understanding that is thrown into shadow. One must pause here. It is tempting to dismiss this as mythology, as the fanciful exaggeration of a pre-scientific people. But to do so is to ignore the vessel that carries the message. To label it myth is a modern convenience, a way to file away the uncomfortable and the unexplained. What happens if we resist that urge? What if we simply sit with the document as it is, without judgment or interpretation? We are left in a silent room, face to face with a piece of clay that makes a calm, procedural claim about the nature of the past. It suggests that before a great flood swept over the earth, the world was governed by a handful of rulers for periods of time that mock the human lifespan. The tablet does not ask for belief. It simply states its record, and the silence that follows its statement is where the real inquiry begins, in the space between what was written and what we are willing to consider. The source of this record is not some mythical, otherworldly realm. It is the soil of Mesopotamia, the flat, sun-baked plains between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. This is the land where, some 6,000 years ago, something unprecedented occurred. Scattered farming villages began to coalesce, growing into the first true cities the world had ever known. Uruk, with its massive walls. Eridu, home of the first temple. Ur, the future birthplace of Abraham. This was a crucible of invention. It was here that humanity devised writing, the wheel, monumental architecture, and the complex bureaucracy needed to manage a large, settled population. These were profoundly practical people, driven by the need to control irrigation, manage surpluses, and record transactions. Their world was one of clay, water, barley, and the meticulous administration of daily life. It is from this pragmatic, grounded civilization that the king list and its impossible numbers emerge. This context is critical. The vast majority of the cuneiform tablets unearthed from these cities are mundane to the extreme. They are economic records, legal codes, ration lists for laborers, letters between merchants, contracts for the sale of land and livestock. The scribes who wrote them were the accountants, lawyers, and administrators of their day. Their primary function was not to create art or to explore the human condition, but to document, to catalog, to measure. Their mindset was one of order, precision, and continuity. And yet, filed away in the same archives, inscribed by the same hands that tallied sacks of grain, we find the cosmological texts, the creation accounts, and the lists of kings who ruled for millennia. They are treated not as a separate category of religious texts, but as part of the same continuous official record of the world. The question, then, becomes one of intent. It is not about whether a king could truly rule for 800 years. The more profound question is why a civilization so deeply invested in the accurate, dispassionate recording of reality would choose to begin its own history with such a sequence. Why would a culture of accountants and bureaucrats meticulously preserve and copy for thousands of years a foundational document whose core data points were, by any rational measure, impossible? They were not trying to deceive. The list's very structure, dry, repetitive, and devoid of narrative drama, argues against it being a work of fiction. It suggests that to the Sumerian scribe, the reign of Alulim was a fact of the same order as a shipment of cedar wood from the north, or the allocation of beer to a temple worker. It was simply part of the record, and this record has a distinct starting point. The king list begins with the line, "After the kingship descended from heaven." Before this event, there is only silence. The scribes, for all their meticulous record-keeping, offer no history for the time before this arrival. The world in their administrative memory simply begins with the establishment of this ordered system of rule. This is perhaps the greatest mystery of all, the one that frames all the others. We are confronted not only by the strangeness of what is written, but by the profound and absolute absence of what is not. The story does not emerge from a primordial chaos. It begins with the imposition of a fully formed system of governance. The true antagonist in this search for understanding is not a flaw in the record, but the perfect, impenetrable wall of silence that stands at its very beginning. If you have remained here, in this quiet space, listening to the echoes from a single piece of clay, it is likely because you sense the same dissonance. It is the feeling that comes from encountering a piece of evidence that does not fit the established narrative, a detail that hints at a story far larger and stranger than the one we have been told. It is the recognition that the world's oldest written records might not be the primitive myths of an ancient people, but a form of precise, technical documentation that we have simply forgotten how to read. The journey into this forgotten history is not for everyone. It requires a willingness to sit with uncertainty, to hold contradiction without rushing to a conclusion. It is a vigil with the past, and it has only just begun. Let us return to the king list, to the physical object. The scribe begins his work with a simple declarative statement, establishing the framework for all that follows. He does not offer a preface or an apology for the information. The stylus presses into the clay, forming the symbols for the first city, Eridu, and the first king, Alulim. Then comes the number, inscribed with the same procedural care as the name. He ruled for 800 years. The statement is left to stand on its own, without commentary. There is no attempt to explain how such a reign was possible, or what it might have felt like to live under a single ruler for a span of time that is, for us, longer than all of recorded human civilization. It is simply the first entry in a very long ledger, the opening line item in an accounting of deep time. The process repeats. The scribe's hand moves with the efficiency of long practice, a motion repeated thousands of times in the recording of far more mundane matters. The second king of Eridu, Alalangar, is entered into the record. His reign follows 36,000 years. The formula is identical: name, city, duration. The repetition is not for dramatic effect. It is the signature of administrative work. It is the language of inventory, of census, of a system designed for clarity and the prevention of ambiguity. 2 kings, 2 entries, a combined total of 800 years. The scribe continues, his focus on the accuracy of the transmission, on ensuring the record is copied without error. He is not an artist crafting a narrative. He is a clerk preserving a database, and the data points are years, counted in the tens of thousands. This pattern continues through the first section of the list, covering the period before the Great Flood. 8 kings in 5 cities. The scribe lists them one by one, each with a reign that strains the very concept of a lifetime. Dumuzid, the shepherd, ruled in Bad Tibira for 36 Asuran years. Enmandur-Ana of Sipar ruled for 21 Shuan years. The numbers are recorded with a consistent, unwavering precision. When the list of pre-Diluvian kings is complete, a summary is provided, as one would expect in a proper administrative document. The total is calculated and noted. 8 kings, a cumulative reign of 200 years. This final tally transforms the individual, unbelievable numbers into a single, cohesive, and even more impossible block of historical time. It is presented not as a myth, but as a final accounting, the closing of a ledger for an entire epoch. One must consider the mindset that produces such a document. This is not the work of a poet attempting to convey a sense of immense antiquity through metaphor. If that were the case, the language would be different, grander, more evocative, less specific. Instead, we are given precise, numerical values. The numbers are not a long time or for many ages. They are 28, 800, 36, 1 43, 200. This specificity is the most unsettling aspect of the record. It suggests that, to the person who inscribed this tablet, these numbers were not symbolic. They were quantities. They were data. The document's cold, factual structure forces us into an uncomfortable position. Either the most pragmatic and detail-oriented civilization of the ancient world began its history with a meticulous, multi-generational accounting error, or we have fundamentally misunderstood what they were counting. Then, abruptly, the list breaks. The flow of kings and cities is interrupted by a single stark event. It is not described with epic language or emotional detail. It is recorded as an administrative boundary, a line drawn in the accounting of time. The scribe writes, "Then the flood swept over." The sentence is simple, declarative, and final. It serves as a divider, separating the world that was from the world that is. There is no story of a hero, no mention of an ark, no divine anger or salvation. In the context of the king list, the flood is not a myth. It is a catastrophic inventory reset, a moment when the old ledger was closed and a new one was opened. The event itself is recorded with the same dispassionate brevity as the reign of a king. Immediately following this line, the record resumes with the same formulaic precision. After the flood swept over, the kingship descended from heaven a second time. The kingship was in Kish. The system reboots. A new city is chosen. A new sequence of rulers begins. But something has fundamentally changed. The numbers, while still immense by our standards, are drastically reduced. The first king of the new dynasty, Jushur of Kish, is recorded as ruling for 200 years. His successor rules for 900 years. The reigns continue to shorten through the subsequent dynasties, from hundreds of years to the more recognizable lifespans of historical kings like Gilgamesh, who is listed as ruling Uruk for 126 years. The document itself, through its own data, records a deep biological or environmental shift. The flood, therefore, functions as the single most important structural element within the list. It is the demarcation line between two distinct phases of existence. The pre-Diluvian world was one of immense stability and longevity, governed by a handful of rulers over spans of time we cannot comprehend. The post-Diluvian world is one of accelerated change, of diminishing lifespans, of a new kind of kingship. The scribe does not explain this change, he simply records it. The data on one side of the line is of a completely different order of magnitude than the data on the other. We are looking at a before and after, a clear point of division that implies a fundamental alteration in the nature of rule, or perhaps in the nature of the rulers themselves. The silence that hangs over this document is profound. We are left alone with the data, with the stark contrast between the two epochs. The list does not invite interpretation. It simply presents its sequence. The orderly, bureaucratic nature of the record resists easy dismissal. It is too structured, too consistent, too much like a genuine attempt at historical accounting. To call it fiction is to imagine a scribe, somewhere around 2100 BCE, inventing not just a story, but an entire system of impossible numbers, a catastrophic reset point, and a subsequent gradual decline in longevity, all recorded in the driest, most administrative style imaginable. The effort required for such a fabrication seems far greater than the effort required to simply copy a record that was believed to be true. Let us now turn from this ledger of time to another set of tablets, found in the same archives, often inscribed by scribes from the same schools. These are the texts that describe the origin of humanity itself. If we set aside the traditional label of mythology and read them as we read the king list, as a form of administrative or technical record, a different kind of pattern emerges. The text known as the Atrahasis does not begin with a poetic act of creation. It begins with a problem of labor management. The junior deities, the Agigi, were tasked with the physical work of maintaining creation, digging canals, building temples. After thousands of years of this toil, they went on strike. They burned their tools and surrounded the dwelling of their chief administrator, Enlil. The response to this labor dispute is recorded not as a divine mystery, but as a practical engineering solution. The ruling council convenes. Enki, the chief scientist or engineer, proposes a plan. He will create a substitute, a primitive worker, to take over the burden of the work. The text is explicit about the purpose of this new being. Its name, Lulu Amelu, translates to something akin to primitive man or mixed worker. Its function is stated in the clearest possible terms. Let him bear the yoke, the work of Enlil. Let man bear the toil of the gods. This is not the language of a sacred covenant. It is the language of a work assignment, the charter for a new class of laborer. The method of this creation is described with a strange, almost biological precision. It is a formula, a list of materials, and a procedure. The chief medical officer, a goddess named Nintu, is tasked with overseeing the process. She is to take clay from the Abzu, the domain of Enki, and mix it with the flesh and blood of a slain deity, a being named Geshtu-e, who was a god who has intelligence. This mixture is to be placed into a mold, and from this process, the first humans will be formed. The text reads less like a hymn and more like a laboratory report or a manufacturing specification. It details the creation of a hybrid being, designed for a specific purpose and brought into existence through a defined, technical procedure. For a moment, pause and listen. Listen to the quiet of the space you are in right now. Note the time. Acknowledge the silence. That specific, measurable silence is the same medium through which these ancient words now travel. It is the space in which the impossible numbers of the king list and the cold formula for a worker race now reside. By marking this moment, you participate in the same act of recording that the scribe once did, creating a small, personal entry in the ledger of your own quiet inquiry. This is the ritual of listening to the past, to be still, and to allow the weight of the record to settle. The story is not in the noise, but in the attention we are willing to give to the silence that follows the words. These creation accounts were not stored in a special sacred library, separate from the business of the world. They were part of the same administrative system that held the king list. Imagine the archivist in ancient Nippur or Uruk. On one shelf, he has the tablets detailing the monthly rations of beer and bread for the temple construction crews. On the shelf below, he has the legal contracts for the sale of fields and livestock. And on the same shelf, or in the same container, he has the tablet that records the creation of the Lulu Amelu, to perform that very construction work, and the list of kings who ruled for millennia before the flood. To the Sumerian archivist, these were all documents of the same class, records of the administration of the world. This lack of separation is perhaps the most powerful evidence of all. It suggests that in the mind of the scribe, there was no fundamental difference between the history of the kings, the origin of the workers, and the daily accounting of the state. They were all part of a single, continuous story of operations. The creation of humanity was a logistical solution to a labor problem. The reigns of the kings were historical data points in a timeline of governance. This pragmatic worldview, this bureaucratic lens applied to the whole of existence, is what makes these texts so profoundly strange. They are not trying to inspire faith or awe. They are documenting a process, a system, a history that, to them, was entirely functional and real. The disturbance created by these records is not that they speak of gods and monsters. It is that they do not. They speak of rulers, administrators, scientists, and laborers. They describe strikes, councils, engineering projects, and work assignments. They ground their cosmology in the language of bureaucracy. A myth can be placed in a separate mental category, admired for its beauty or its wisdom, and safely ignored as a factual account. But what are we to do with an administrative report that details the engineering of our own species? How do we file away a piece of paperwork that lists, with mundane precision, the functional purpose for our existence? The texts resist being filed away. They demand to be read as what they appear to be, the records of a forgotten world. And this was not the isolated belief of a single city or a single generation of scribes. The king list, in various forms and fragments, has been unearthed from sites all across southern Mesopotamia, Nippur, Larsa, Sippar, Isin. For more than 1,000 years, from the end of the 3rd millennium to the time of Alexander the Great, scribes continued to copy and preserve this specific history of pre-Diluvian kings and their impossible reigns. This was not a forgotten piece of folklore. It was a foundational document of their civilization, a standardized text that was considered essential knowledge for anyone educated in the scribal arts. Its preservation was a matter of state importance, a way of maintaining the unbroken chain of authority that began when kingship first descended from heaven. The same pattern of preservation and repetition holds for the creation accounts. The core narrative of the Atrahasis, humanity created from clay and divine blood to serve as workers, is not a singular tale. It is a thematic backbone that runs through Mesopotamian thought. It is echoed in the later, more famous Babylonian creation epic, the Enuma Elish, where the victorious god Marduk declares his intention to create a savage, a primitive man, he whose purpose will be to serve the gods and free them from their toil. Though the details and the divine names may change, the fundamental premise remains constant. Humanity's origin is functional, our purpose is labor, and our existence is a solution to a problem faced by a pre-existing non-human ruling class. We are left, then, not with a single, strange tablet, but with a body of interconnected administrative and historical documents. They present a cohesive, if unbelievable, account of the world. A list of rulers with impossibly long lives, a catastrophic flood that acts as a historical dividing line, and a technical manual for the creation of a worker species designed to perform manual labor. When viewed in isolation, each can be dismissed. The king list as symbolic numerology, the creation story as a primitive myth. But when placed side by side, as they were in the ancient archives, they begin to look less like disparate stories and more like chapters from the same operations manual, the same unsettling history of the world. The question shifts from what each document means to what kind of world they describe when taken together. The disturbance of a single record can be contained. An anomaly can be filed away, labeled as local folklore, a peculiarity of one culture's imagination confined to the sun-baked plains of ancient Sumer. It becomes a historical curiosity, a strange but isolated data point. But the archives of the world are not islands. They are fragments of a single, vast, and now shattered library. The work of the researcher, the archaeologist, is not to remain in one room under one light, but to move between them. It is the slow, patient work of gathering scattered pages, of placing them side by side, driven by the quiet suspicion that a story told in one place may have been heard, or lived in another. The dust of Mesopotamia is fine and pale, but the dust of the Nile Valley is darker, heavier with the weight of a different sun. And in that dust, the same echoes are found. The hands of the researcher are careful as they handle the fragments, not of clay this time, but of papyrus, brittle with age, its fibers threatening to disintegrate into the silence of the archive. This is the Turin King Papyrus, a document from ancient Egypt, compiled nearly 1,000 years after the first Sumerian lists were inscribed. It is a wreck, a puzzle of over 300 pieces, yet what remains is unsettlingly familiar. Like its Sumerian counterpart, it is a list of rulers, a document of succession. And it too begins not with men, but with a different class of being. It records the reigns of the Neteru, the gods, who ruled for thousands of years. It then lists the Shemsu Hor, the followers of Horus, semi-divine kings who reigned for a further 420 years, before the first mortal pharaoh, Menes, finally takes the throne. Here, then, in the administrative records of the other great pillar of ancient civilization, the same structure appears. It is a foundational memory, preserved by the meticulous scribes of the pharaohs, of a long period of divine and semi-divine rule preceding their own recorded history. The numbers are different, the names have changed, but the pattern is identical. A long epoch of non-human governance, a transitionary period, and then the beginning of human kingship with drastically shorter lifespans. Two of the world's most ancient and influential cultures, separated by 1,000 miles of desert and 1,000 years of history both chose to anchor their legitimacy in the same impossible timeline. The anomaly is no longer isolated. It has found a reflection, and the quiet of the archive deepens as the coincidence becomes too loud to ignore. One must consider the function of such a document. These were not poems meant to entertain, nor were they theological treatises meant to inspire faith. They were political and administrative tools. Their purpose was to establish an unbroken chain of legitimate rule, stretching from the present king back to the very origin of order itself. To the Egyptian scribe, the reign of a god like Ra was as essential to the legitimacy of his pharaoh as the reign of a historical figure like Khufu. It was the first link in the chain. The fact that this specific framework, a handover from a long-lived divine race to a short-lived human one, was the chosen method for establishing legitimacy in two independent, powerful civilizations suggests it was not an invention. It suggests it was an inheritance, a deeply embedded memory of how the world was once organized. The pattern of recurrence is not limited to the rulers. Let us return to that stark, administrative line in the Sumerian list. Then the flood swept over. This event, this great reset, is not a footnote. It is the central fulcrum of the entire timeline. And this memory of a world-destroying deluge is perhaps the most widespread and consistent story in all of human tradition. The researcher's work expands, the map on the table growing wider, dotted with points of connection. In Mesopotamia, the story of the flood is told not only in the king list, but in the epics of Atrahasis and Gilgamesh, where a hero is warned to build a boat to survive the waters sent to destroy mankind. The details are specific: the boat's dimensions, the sealing with bitumen, the preservation of the seed of all living things. This is not a vague memory of a local river overflowing its banks. It is the account of a specific global catastrophe, and it is everywhere. The researcher moves from one set of records to another, across continents and millennia. In ancient India, the Matsya Purana tells of Manu, a progenitor of humanity, warned by the god Vishnu in the form of a fish to build a great ship, to escape a world-ending flood. In ancient Greece, the story of Deucalion and Pyrrha echoes the same theme. Across the ocean, in the traditions of the Maya of Mesoamerica, the Popol Vuh describes a great flood sent by the gods to wipe out a previous flawed creation of humanity. The details differ, but the core event remains constant. A prior age of the world, populated by beings different from ourselves, brought to a sudden and violent end by a deluge of water. The sheer ubiquity of this narrative is staggering. It appears in the traditions of hundreds of cultures, on every inhabited continent. While local floods are common, the memory preserved here is of a singular, epoch-ending event. It consistently serves the same structural purpose as it does in the Sumerian king list: to draw a line between the time of the gods, or ancestors, and the time of modern man. The flood is the mechanism that cleanses the slate, that ends the old world, and allows the new one to begin. The pattern is too widespread for simple cultural diffusion to be a sufficient explanation. It behaves less like a story that was told, and more like a memory that was shared by the survivors of a genuine worldwide cataclysm. The human mind seeks patterns, but it also resists them when they lead to uncomfortable conclusions. It is easier to see these as independent myths, born from a common human fear of nature's power. Yet, the work of the researcher is to honor the details, and the details resist this simple explanation. The consistency of the structure, the before and after, the change in the nature of life and rule, is a structural fingerprint left on the memory of our species. The flood is not the story. It is the scar tissue, the evidence of a wound so deep that every culture retained a memory of it. We are looking at the echoes of a single catastrophic filter through which our ancestors passed, an event that reset the course of life on the planet. This is the point where the investigation changes. It is no longer about a single strange tablet in a quiet museum. It is about a global pattern, a ghost in the machine of human history. The work shifts from simple translation to a kind of signal analysis, listening for a coherent message beneath the noise of 1,000 different languages and traditions. The researcher is no longer just an archaeologist or a linguist. They become a cartographer of forgotten memories, mapping the echoes of a single, coherent narrative that has been shattered into 1,000,000 cultural fragments. The task is immense, the silence of the archives filled with the weight of these connections, the faint lines of correspondence that crisscross the globe, all pointing back to a single, shared origin story. If you have followed this path this far, moving from the clay of Sumer to the papyrus of Egypt, and from there to the wider world, you are no longer a passive observer. You are participating in the quiet work of reconnection. To see these patterns is to engage in a form of seeing that requires patience, a willingness to hold disparate pieces of evidence together until they form a coherent image. It is an act of intellectual vigil, a refusal to accept the easy explanation. The journey from here only goes deeper, for the pattern of shared memory extends beyond the timeline of kings and the catastrophe of the flood. It touches upon the very nature of what we are. Let us return to the purpose of our own creation, as recorded by the Sumerian scribe. Humanity, the Lulu Amalu, was brought into being to perform labor, to bear the toil of the gods. The language is functional, economic, devoid of sacred mystery. This too could be dismissed as a local peculiarity, a cynical quirk of Mesopotamian theology. But the researcher, tracing the lines of connection, finds this same idea reflected elsewhere. In the Egyptian coffin texts, the Creator God declares, "I made every man like his fellow. Their hearts did not disobey what I had said." And in other texts, humanity is referred to as the cattle of God, implying a relationship of owner and owned, of shepherd and flock, a species brought into being to serve the needs of its creator. The theme is consistent, even if the language changes. The oldest records of our species do not describe us as the pinnacle of a natural process or the beloved children of a benevolent creator. They define us by our function. We were made to maintain the world, to dig the canals, to build the temples, to provide the sustenance that the ruling class required. It is a profoundly unsentimental view of our own origins. It frames our existence in pragmatic, almost industrial terms. This is not a pattern one would expect to find in the foundational myths of proud and powerful civilizations. Yet here it is, in the deepest strata of the archaeological record, a recurring definition of humanity as a workforce. The implications of this are unsettling. It suggests that the memory of being a subservient species is woven into our oldest traditions. It is a memory so deeply buried that we have mistaken it for religious metaphor. But the administrative language of the Sumerian and Akkadian texts, the functional relationship described in the Egyptian records, argues against metaphor. It points to a literal, historical reality. We are looking at a pattern that suggests the relationship between the first humans and the others, who governed them, was not one of worshipper and deity, but of employee and employer, or perhaps more starkly, of asset and owner. The silence that follows this realization is the silence of a truth that has been hidden in plain sight. The work in the archive now becomes even more granular. The researcher's tools are no longer the brush and the pickaxe, but the magnifying glass and the lexical database. The search is for connections that lie deeper than narrative parallels. It is a search for technical data, for shared markers of knowledge that could not have arisen independently. The focus shifts to numbers, to units of measure, to astronomical constants. The fragments are re-examined, not for what they say, but for how they say it, for the underlying systems of knowledge they reveal. This is the most painstaking work of all, a slow comparison of numerical systems, of celestial observations, of architectural ratios, seeking a common technical language beneath the babble of ancient tongues. And here, another pattern emerges, colder and more precise than any myth. A specific number begins to recur in contexts that are difficult to explain away. The number 3600. In Sumer, it was the value of the highest unit in their sexagesimal system, the sar. The reign of the second pre-Diluvian king, Alalangar, was 36 Zoaozaran years, 10 sars. The reign of Dumuzid was also 36 Zoaozaran years. The number is a fundamental building block of their cosmological mathematics. But then the researcher finds it again, in a different context. Berossus, a Babylonian priest writing in Greek centuries later, records the same pre-Diluvian history and uses a unit of time he calls a saros, equal to 600 years, to measure the reigns. The name is almost identical. The value is the same. This is no longer a shared story. This is a shared unit of advanced temporal calculation, preserved across cultures and thousands of years. It is a piece of technical data, and it connects to something else: astronomy. The Saros cycle, a period of approximately 18 years, 11 days, used to predict eclipses, was a cornerstone of Babylonian knowledge inherited from their Sumerian predecessors. The number 3600, or its multiples and fractions, appears to be a key component of a lost system of celestial mechanics and historical accounting. A myth can be borrowed, a story can be retold, but a complex mathematical and astronomical system, consistently applied to the same historical framework, does not travel by chance. It suggests a common source of instruction, a single, highly advanced system of knowledge that was inherited in fragmented form by the great civilizations of the ancient world. The researcher sits in the low light of the archive, a Sumerian tablet on one side, a Greek translation of a Babylonian text on the other. The room is silent, but the connection between the fragments is not. The recurrence of a number like 3600 is a fingerprint, a technical marker that links these disparate records not just by theme, but by a shared underlying science. The pattern is no longer merely conceptual, it is mathematical. It suggests that the impossible reigns of the kings were not random exaggerations, but calculations based on a specific and now forgotten unit of time, a unit deeply connected to the orbital mechanics of the solar system. The history recorded by the scribes may have been more than a list of events. It may have been a form of physics. The scale of what is being uncovered begins to eclipse the individual records. We are no longer looking at the history of Sumer, or Egypt, or Babylon. We are looking at the faint, ghostly outline of a global system of knowledge and administration that existed in the deepest antiquity. The recurring patterns, the long-lived rulers, the catastrophic flood, the creation of a worker race, and the shared technical constants are the shattered pieces of this system. They are like the scattered gears and levers of a great machine whose purpose and design we have forgotten. The silence of the past is not empty. It is the space left by the destruction of this original coherent record. The work of the researcher is to see, in the shape of the fragments, the shadow of the whole. The records do not speak of gods in the way we have come to understand them. The beings who populate the administrative landscape of the earliest tablets are not ethereal, omnipotent forces of nature. They are presented as individuals with names, specific titles, and clearly delineated responsibilities. They form a structured, hierarchical organization. At the top is Anu, whose name is often used as a determinative for divinity itself, but whose role in the texts is akin to a remote chairman or sovereign, residing elsewhere. His authority is absolute but rarely exercised directly. Decrees are issued in his name, but the operational management of the terrestrial project falls to his sons, Enlil and Enki. This is not a pantheon born of poetic imagination. It is the organizational chart of a cosmic enterprise, recorded with the same dispassionate clarity as a list of temple assets. Enlil is described as the commander, the chief executive on the ground. His title, Lord of the Command, is literal. The texts portray him as the administrator of the entire earthly settlement, responsible for enforcing decrees, assigning territories, and maintaining order. When humanity is created, it is Enlil who supervises their labor, and later becomes irritated by their noise, viewing it as an operational disruption that interferes with the settlement's function. His actions, often interpreted as those of a wrathful deity, are framed in the texts as the decisions of a strict, pragmatic manager dealing with an unruly workforce. He is not a god of the storm. He is the executive in charge of the mission, whose primary concern is the efficient execution of the established plan. In contrast, Enki is the head of a different department. His domain is the Abzu, and his title is often Lord of the Earth, but his function is that of a chief scientist or engineer. It is Enki who possesses the technical knowledge, the understanding of genetics and engineering required to solve the labor crisis of the Igigi. He is the one who designs the Lulu Amalu. The texts consistently depict him as an innovator, a problem solver, a master of crafts and sciences. He is not a mystical figure of wisdom. He is a being of immense practical and technical intelligence. The disputes between him and his brother Enlil read less like cosmic battles between good and evil, and more like professional disagreements between a head of operations and a head of research and development over the best way to manage a complex project and its living assets. The other figures in this hierarchy are also defined by their roles. There is Nintu or Ninhursag, the chief medical officer who oversees the biological procedures of creation. There is Utu, the sun god, who is in charge of communications and justice, a kind of chief magistrate. There is Inanna, a figure of complex and often contradictory roles, but frequently depicted as being in charge of specific territories or city-states, a regional governor. Each being has a jurisdiction, a set of responsibilities, and a place within the command structure. The Sumerian pantheon is, in effect, a roster of colonial administrators, each with a job to do. Their stories are not myths of creation. They are the logbooks, the personnel files, and the inter-office memos of a long-forgotten administration. Consider the language used to describe their arrival. The texts do not say they were born from the sky or the sea. They state that they came down to earth. Their cities, like Eridu, are established as their first headquarters. The pre-diluvian kings on the king list are these very beings, or their appointed deputies, ruling directly from these centers of operation. Their impossibly long reigns are not a measure of a human life, but the tenure of an administrator overseeing a project whose timescale is vast beyond our own. The king list, in this light, is not a list of human kings at all. It is a record of the successive commandants of the Earth mission, a ledger of their terms of office before a great operational reset. Their actions, as recorded by the scribes, are consistently pragmatic and terrestrial. They are not shown performing abstract miracles. They are shown surveying the land, digging canals, and establishing agriculture. They bring knowledge. The texts credit them with teaching humanity the fundamentals of civilization: how to build cities, how to farm, how to write, how to observe the stars. They are not presented as saviors bestowing divine grace, but as instructors, as masters passing on a simplified set of operating instructions to a newly created subservient species. The relationship is one of teacher to student, of foreman to laborer, of a technologically superior group establishing a functional society for its own benefit. The silence surrounding their physical nature is itself a form of data. The scribes, so meticulous in recording titles, actions, and decrees, offer almost no physical descriptions. These beings are not described with wings of fire or bodies made of stars. They are simply present. They walk, they speak, they eat, they convene in assemblies. Their otherness is defined not by their appearance, but by their capabilities and their longevity. They possess a sha, a kind of technological aura or power that is never fully explained but is consistently associated with their authority. They pilot skyboats, the Mu, and possess weapons of terrifying power. Their otherness is a matter of technology and biology, not of spirit. The great assemblies of these beings, described in texts like the Enuma Elish, read like board meetings. They gather to discuss problems, to receive reports, to debate courses of action, and to vote on resolutions. The decision to create humanity is the result of such a meeting. The decision to destroy it in the flood is another. These are not the whimsical acts of capricious gods. They are the calculated, administrative decisions of a governing council weighing the costs and benefits of their own creation. The fate of the world is decided not in a clash of cosmic principles, but in a committee room, and the outcome is recorded as a formal decree. This functional, non-mystical portrayal persists even in the most dramatic events. The flood itself, as described in the Atrahasis, is preceded by Enlil's formal complaint about the noise of humanity. The decision to wipe the slate clean is a motion passed by the assembly. Enki's subsequent act of saving a human, Zeusudra, is a breach of protocol, an act of insubordination for which he must later answer. He does not warn the man out of a sense of compassion, but as a way of preserving his workmanship. The entire epic is framed as a political and administrative conflict within the ruling class, with humanity as the subject of their dispute. The landscape itself is divided and assigned according to this administrative logic. After the flood, the texts describe the world being partitioned anew. Different regions are assigned to different ruling figures. This is not the organic emergence of cultural territories. It is a planned allocation of resources and jurisdictions, a post-catastrophe reorganization. The cities and their temples are not just places of worship. They are centers of command and control, administrative hubs from which the surrounding lands are managed. The ziggurat is not a stairway to a metaphysical heaven, but perhaps a literal landing platform, a link between the terrestrial operations and the domain of the chairman, Anu, who remains in the heavens. The researcher, moving through these archives, is confronted by this persistent, pervasive sense of order. It is a world governed by rules, by hierarchies, by technical processes. The presence of these others is the central organizing principle of that world. They are the source of law, the arbiters of knowledge, the architects of society, and they are utterly alien in their pragmatism. They do not ask for love or faith, only for service and obedience. They do not offer salvation, only a role within their system. The silence in the texts where we would expect to find emotion or spirituality is the most unnerving feature of all. It is the silence of a purely functional relationship. What does it mean to be the product of such a relationship? The texts suggest that our core purpose, the reason for our very existence, was to be a utility. This is a history that offers no comfort, no sense of cosmic specialness. It suggests that the dawn of our consciousness was also the dawn of our servitude. This is the cold data point that lies at the heart of the Sumerian record, a finding so stark that it is easier to label it myth than to confront its implications. To read these texts as they were written is to see ourselves not as fallen angels, but as manufactured assets. The departure or withdrawal of these beings from direct rule is another administrative event. After the flood, kingship is lowered from heaven a second time, but the nature of the rulers changes. The lifespans shorten. A new class of intermediary rulers, human kings, is installed. They are described as shepherds, tasked with managing the flock of humanity on behalf of the true owners, the pharaohs of Egypt, the kings of Sumer and Akkad. Their legitimacy was based on this claim of being the appointed representatives of the absent administrators. Kingship was not an inherent human right, but a franchise, a contract granted from above. The evidence for this functional reality is not loud. It is quiet, consistent, and woven into the very grammar of the world's first writings. It is in the lists of titles, the records of land assignments, the formulas for law codes, the technical specifications for creation. It is a pattern that is too detailed, too internally consistent, and too devoid of poetic flourish to be a simple invention. It is the ghost of a system, the faint outline of a world organized according to a logic that is not our own. The others were not gods. They were the system's architects and managers. And so, we are left in the silence of the archive, surrounded by the procedural documents of our own making. The tablets do not offer answers. They offer records. They present a version of the past that is profoundly alienating, yet meticulously documented. It suggests a history where the great questions of human existence, who are we? Why are we here? Were answered on the first day, not with a philosophical treatise, but with a work order. The true mystery is not whether these beings existed, but what it means to live in the world they left behind, a world built upon their foundations, still echoing with the memory of their commands. The trail does not end here, it fractures. The direct administrative record begins to fade, replaced by echoes, by reflections in later cultures that remembered the masters but forgot their titles. The functional administrators slowly transform into the mythological gods of the later pantheons. Enlil becomes Zeus. Enki becomes Prometheus. The memory of the system remained, but its operational logic was lost, replaced by the drama of human emotion and metaphor. The search must now turn from the clear, cold records of the administrators to the fragmented, distorted memories of the workers, searching for the traces of the original blueprint in the ruins of the civilizations that followed. The administrative record is a map. It details the known world, its territories, its governors, its assets. But the most important feature of any map is not what it shows, but where it ends. Beyond its edges lies the unknown, the unrecorded. The investigation of the past eventually arrives at this border. We have followed the clear, procedural lines of the Sumerian scribes, tracing a history of rulers and their functions. Now we must turn our attention to the vast, silent territories that surround this map, the gaps in the record, the periods of inexplicable quiet, the places where the stylus simply stopped moving. Here, in the unwritten spaces, the true antagonist of this story finally reveals itself. It is the silence between the layers, a structured and profound absence that seems to be not an accident of time, but a part of the design itself. The archaeologist knows this silence intimately. It is a physical reality, encountered in the earth itself. A trench cut through a tell, the mound of a buried city, reveals its history in strata, like the pages of a book. Here is a layer of dense occupation. Pottery shards, animal bones, the foundations of houses, the residue of life. Above it, another layer, showing a different style of pottery, a new phase of construction. But sometimes, between these two vibrant layers of activity, there is another. It is a sterile band of wind-blown sand and silt, devoid of artifacts, showing no evidence of human life. It is a page that has been left intentionally blank. For decades or centuries, a city that had bustled with administrative life simply ceased to be. The record does not say why. The earth only shows that for a time there was nothing. The silence is archaeological fact. Consider the end of the 4th millennium BCE. A cultural phenomenon known as the Uruk expansion radiates out from southern Mesopotamia. Sumerian artifacts, architectural styles, and administrative tools, like cylinder seals and beveled rim bowls, suddenly appear in a vast network of sites, from the highlands of Iran to the plains of Syria and the mountains of Anatolia. It is the footprint of a vast, centrally managed system of trade and colonial administration. Then, just as suddenly as it began, it collapses. Around 3100 BCE, the entire network is abandoned. The outposts are deserted. The trade routes fall silent. There is no evidence of widespread warfare or natural disaster in the archaeological record. The system is simply switched off. The scribes who meticulously managed this enterprise offer no explanation for its termination. The silence that follows is not the quiet of a world before history, but the eerie stillness of a project that has been abruptly and completely decommissioned. One must pause in this stillness. This is not the slow decay of an empire, the gradual decline over generations. This is a sudden stop. It is the difference between a candle burning down and a lamp being unplugged from its source. The evidence suggests a highly organized, literate, and powerful system that, for a time, coordinated the resources of the entire Near East. And then, it was gone. The silence it left behind is not empty. It is charged with the ghost of that immense, vanished complexity. It is a silence that speaks of a decision, a command issued and obeyed, an operation concluded. The absence of a reason is what transforms this historical event into a profound and unsettling mystery. We are left looking at the abandoned machinery, with no access to the final report that explains the shutdown. The silence is not only in the soil, but in the clay itself. The researcher handles a tablet, a fragment of a larger whole. The text is a legal code, or perhaps a cosmological account. The lines of cuneiform are clear and precise, but then the text runs to a jagged edge. The tablet is broken. The break is not random. It occurs precisely at the point where a critical piece of information was being conveyed. The name of a deity's father, the specific punishment for a crime, the outcome of a divine assembly. The rest of the sentence is lost in the missing shard, a piece of the puzzle that has fallen into the abyss of time. The mind naturally tries to fill the gap, to extrapolate, but it is an act of imagination, not of reading. The document is muted, its testimony cut short. The lacuna, the empty space, becomes the most powerful part of the text, a wound in the body of the record. This destruction was not always the slow work of time. The great library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh, the source of so many of the tablets we now possess, was not a peaceful archive that slowly fell into ruin. It was destroyed in a great fire when the city was sacked in 612 BCE. The flames that consumed the palace were an act of deliberate annihilation, an attempt to wipe the Assyrian Empire from the face of the earth. And yet, that act of destruction was also an act of preservation. The unbaked clay tablets in the library were fired in the inferno, hardened into ceramic, and thus saved for posterity. We owe our knowledge to an act of violent, intentional erasure. The question that hangs in the air, thick as the smoke of that ancient fire, is what was lost. For every tablet that was hardened, how many others were shattered? For every record that survived, how much knowledge was the fire intended to permanently silence? This accident of preservation points to an even greater absence. The vast majority of the cuneiform records were never meant to last. They were the mundane, day-to-day paperwork of a massive bureaucracy. Receipts for goods, ration lists for workers, tallies of livestock. They were written on wet clay that was then left to dry in the sun. When the information was no longer needed, the tablet would be wetted and smoothed over, its surface wiped clean for a new record. They were the reusable hard drives of the ancient world. The fraction of records that have survived to our time are almost exclusively those that were caught in fires, baked by chance. This means that we are trying to reconstruct a world from its accidentally preserved trash, from the invoices and memos that happened to be in the building when it burned down. The true comprehensive archive of the Sumerian world, the complete record of its operations, is gone. It was erased by its own creators as a matter of routine efficiency. Pause again. Consider the sheer scale of what is not there. We are attempting to understand a civilization by reading a handful of its pages, saved by the very fires that were meant to destroy them. The silence, then, is not a gap in the story. It is the story. The history we have is the exception. The rule is absence. The invisible antagonist is this overwhelming structural oblivion. If you are here in this moment contemplating this vast, unreadable library, take a second. Note the time on your screen, the quality of the light in your room. Register this specific moment of your own quiet attention. In the comments, if you feel so moved, simply record that moment. The time, the place. Let it be a small, personal mark against the great silence, a gesture that acknowledges the depth of what has been lost. It is a ritual of shared witness to the great, unwritten record. The most profound silence of all stands at the very beginning of the record. Before the declarative statement, after the kingship descended from heaven, there is a perfect and total void. The Sumerian scribes, meticulous chroniclers of their own world, list no ancestors before this event. They record no history of a slow climb from primitive beginnings, no story of their own evolution. Their official administrative memory begins with the arrival of a fully formed system of governance from an external source. It is a history that begins at Chapter 1, with no preface, no introduction. This is not the silence of a people who have forgotten their origins. It is the silence of a record that begins with an installation, the booting up of a new operating system. The time before its activation is simply not part of the log file. This absence is mirrored in the ground. The king list names 5 cities as the centers of power before the flood: Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larak, Sippar, and Shuruppak. Archaeologists have identified the sites of these cities as they existed in later periods. But the pre-Diluvian strata, the layers that should correspond to the reigns of kings who ruled for tens of thousands of years, are missing. There are no remains of the grand civilizations that these rulers would have governed. The archaeological record does not support the textual record. This creates a stark choice. Either the scribes invented their entire foundational history, a history of specific cities and named rulers, for no apparent reason, or that history took place in a manner that did not leave behind the kind of physical evidence we are trained to look for. The silence from the earth is as deafening as the silence from the texts. This pattern of appearing and disappearing is not confined to cities. It applies to knowledge itself. The sudden appearance of advanced astronomical knowledge, complex mathematics, and sophisticated legal codes in early Sumer is a persistent enigma. This knowledge does not appear to evolve gradually. It arrives as a complete package. Then, in the periods of collapse that follow, such as the Dark Age after the fall of the Akkadian Empire, much of this knowledge seems to vanish. It is as if a technical manual was provided, and then later, it was taken away. The history of knowledge in Mesopotamia is not a smooth, upward curve of progress. It is a series of brilliant flashes, followed by periods of shadow and forgetting. The silence here is a loss of information, a societal amnesia that suggests the knowledge was never truly their own, but an inheritance that could be, and was, lost. We might re-examine the concept of the Abzu in this light. It is the domain of Enki, the god of knowledge and science. It is often translated as a mythical, watery abyss. But what if this translation is too poetic? What if the Abzu was a more literal concept, a place or an object, a repository of data, an archive of immense knowledge? The texts describe it as the source from which all technology and wisdom flows. Perhaps the periods of intellectual darkness correspond to times when access to this source was cut off. The silence is not just forgetting, it is a disconnection. The administrators who held the key to this database may have restricted access or left altogether, taking their library with them. The silence becomes a symptom of a lost connection to the source code of their civilization. The degradation of knowledge is also visible in the evolution of language. The Sumerian language, in which the oldest records were written, is a linguistic isolate. It has no known relatives. By 2000 BCE, it was no longer a spoken language, replaced by Akkadian. It survived only as a liturgical and scholarly language, preserved by scribes who may not have fully grasped the nuances of the original texts they were so carefully copying. We are reading their history through the filter of a dead language, translated by a second, also dead language, before being rendered into our own. Each layer of translation adds another veil of silence, another opportunity for the original technical meaning of a word to be lost and replaced by a more poetic or mythical interpretation. The invisible antagonist is the entropy of meaning itself, the slow decay of signal into noise over the millennia. This process of decay is relentless. History is not a monument of stone, but a sandcastle, constantly eroded by the winds of time. The survival of any single tablet is a statistical improbability, a message in a bottle that has miraculously washed ashore after a journey of 5,000 years. Most of the bottles were shattered. Most of the messages were lost at sea. To sit in the archive and hold one of these fragments is to be acutely aware of the vast ocean of silence from which it came. The antagonist is not a force that can be fought. It is a fundamental condition of the universe, that order decays into chaos, that memory fades into forgetting, that records turn to dust. Our work is a quiet act of defiance against this overwhelming tide. And within the records that did survive, the most profound silence concerns motive. The texts are a vast administrative ledger, detailing what was done, by whom, and when. They record the decision to create the Lulu Amelu. They record the assignment of their toil. They record the laws they were to live by and the cities they were to build. But they never once state the ultimate purpose of the entire enterprise. Why was this planet chosen? What was the final goal of the administrators? Was it a mining operation, a colonial outpost, a scientific experiment? The texts are the project files for a massive undertaking, but the mission statement, the one document that would explain the why, is missing. This silence is clearly not accidental. It is a strategic omission, the purposeful withholding of the one piece of information that would give context to everything else. This silence culminates in the departure. The texts from later periods show the others receding from the world. They are no longer present as direct administrators on the ground. They withdraw to the heavens, their commands becoming more distant, their presence transforming from a physical reality into a theological concept. But the record offers no final report, no explanation for this withdrawal. Did they leave? Was their project completed? Was it a failure? They simply fade from the administrative record, their active management replaced by a system of human intermediaries, the new kings, who rule in their name. The end of their direct involvement is the final, greatest silence. The office is closed, the managers have gone home, and the workers have been left to run the factory on their own, with only a fragmented set of old instruction manuals to guide them. This cumulative absence, from the sterile layers in the earth to the missing motive at the heart of the texts, is not a passive backdrop to the story. It is an active, shaping force. It is the invisible antagonist that has defined our entire search for the past. This silence resists our questions. It obscures the evidence. It ensures that the truth remains fragmented and elusive. We are not grappling with a competing narrative, but with the ghost of a narrative that has been systematically or catastrophically erased. The challenge is not to find the right answer, but to learn how to ask questions of a void. We are fighting not against a lie, but against an overwhelming and perhaps intentional absence of memory. To understand what was recorded, we must first learn to read what was erased. The gaps are not mere imperfections in the historical record. They are data points in themselves. They are the shadows cast by a vast unseen object. The shape of the silence tells a story. It speaks of events so profound they could not be written down, of knowledge so powerful it had to be removed, of a history so traumatic it could only be forgotten. The silence is the scar tissue of the past. The next step in this inquiry, therefore, is not to search for more words, but to listen more closely to the spaces between them, to treat the absence itself as the primary text. For it is in the heart of this great forgetting that the final and largest implications of this entire story are waiting. We have reached a place of convergence. The threads of inquiry, pulled from the clay of Sumer, the papyrus of Egypt, and the scattered memories of 100 cultures, now lie together on the archival table. Here is the ledger of impossible reigns, its numbers cold and precise. Here is the technical formula for a worker race, its language stripped of all poetry. Here is the stark administrative line drawn by a global flood, a catastrophic reset of the world's inventory. And here, surrounding them all, is the profound and structured silence of the things that were not written, the histories that were erased. We have, until now, examined these pieces in isolation, but the time has come to see them not as fragments, but as the shattered components of a single, coherent machine, and to ask what that machine was built to do. The implication that begins to form in the quiet of this space is one of immense, systemic order. These are not disparate myths, born of a primitive fear of the dark. They are the interlocking parts of a single, overarching narrative that describes a world under administration. The long-lived rulers, the engineered workforce, the periodic resets of the system. These elements function together with a terrifying bureaucratic logic. It suggests that the earliest period of life on this planet was not a chaotic emergence, but a managed project, a vast and long-term enterprise with a clear hierarchy, a defined purpose, and a set of operational protocols. The records are not stories. They are the faint, surviving echoes of the project's internal documentation, the faded blueprints of a world we were born into but never truly understood. This realization forces us to reevaluate the very nature of the texts themselves. We have been trained to read them as religion, to interpret their language as metaphor. But what if that is a fundamental error of translation, a projection of our own modern sensibilities onto a record that was never meant to be spiritual? What if the scribe who wrote of kingship descending from heaven was not describing a mystical event, but recording the establishment of a command structure, using the most precise language he had for a concept that originated off-world? To read the texts this way is to strip them of their comforting mythological veil, and to see them for what their structure suggests they are: a history, a technical manual, and a legal code for a planet under new management. One must be still for a moment to feel the weight of this. The entire foundation of our understanding of the ancient world rests on the assumption that our ancestors were inventing gods to explain the world around them. But the evidence, when read in its own administrative context, suggests the opposite. They were not inventing. They were remembering. They were documenting the system they were born into. They were preserving the memory of the architects, the engineers, the administrators who designed their reality. Our oldest sacred stories may not be our attempts to reach for the divine. They may be the lingering, degraded memory of a time when the divine walked among us, not as gods, but as governors. This interpretation gains its true power when we lift our eyes from Mesopotamia and see the same structural pattern reflected across the globe. The memory of long-lived non-human rulers, the world-destroying flood, and the subsequent re-establishment of a new order under human kings. This is not a local story. It is the foundational memory of our species. The consistency of this narrative framework across disconnected cultures is the single most powerful piece of evidence we have. It transforms the Sumerian record from a strange anomaly into the most detailed surviving fragment of a lost, universal history. It suggests that all of humanity went through the same experience, that we are all survivors of the same shipwreck, clinging to different pieces of the same shattered vessel. The question then becomes one of origin. If this was a global system, a single, coherent project, then it must have had a single source. The diffusion of myths and legends is insufficient to explain the survival of such specific structural and technical data points across thousands of years and impassable oceans. The pattern points not to a shared story, but to a shared reality, a period in the deep past when the entire planet was operating under a unified command. The mystery is no longer confined to the dusty plains of Iraq. It expands to encompass the entire globe, and asks us to find the point of origin for a civilization that appears to have been planetary in its scope and influence. Within this framework, the others of the Sumerian texts cease to be local deities. They become the only logical candidates for the architects and administrators of this global system. Their recorded actions, surveying the land, establishing cities, creating a workforce, and laying down laws, are precisely the activities one would expect from a technologically advanced group establishing a colonial or industrial enterprise on a new world. They are the common variable that explains the sudden appearance of civilization, the shared astronomical and mathematical knowledge, and the consistent memory of a time before human self-rule. They are not an invention to explain the system. The system, as recorded, is inexplicable without them. The Great Flood, in this context, is no longer a simple act of divine wrath. It becomes a strategic, operational event. It is the great dividing line, the catastrophic termination of one phase of the project and the beginning of another. It is the event that shattered the unified global system, destroyed its infrastructure, and wiped its operational memory from the minds of most of its surviving workers. The world that came after was a world of fragments, a world of forgetting. The flood is the reason we are left with only echoes and ruins. It was the mechanism of erasure, the event that created the great silence which has haunted our history ever since, a planetary-scale trauma that reset the course of life on Earth. This is a threshold in the archive, a point where the collection of evidence gives way to the contemplation of its full meaning. The path from here leads into territories of thought that are far stranger and more profound than the simple study of ancient history. To continue this watch requires a willingness to follow the evidence, even when it leads to the edge of what we thought was possible. This story, etched into the world's oldest clay, is not a self-contained mystery. It is a single chapter in a much larger, and still unfolding, narrative. The implication is not an answer, but a doorway into a far larger room. If this framework holds, then the most profound implication is this: human history, as we have written it, is not the story of our beginning. It is the story of what happened after. The true beginning was over. Our 5,000 years of recorded civilization, from the first kings of Egypt and Sumer to the present day, is not the main narrative. It is an epilogue, a long and often chaotic period of recovery and forgetting that followed the collapse of a much older, more advanced, and globally integrated system. We are not the builders of civilization. We are its inheritors, attempting to piece together a world from the ruins and the fragmented instruction manuals left behind by the original architects. We are like a people who awoke in a vast and ancient house that we did not build. We learned to use its rooms, to operate some of its strange machinery, to read a few of the faded labels on its controls. We marvel at its construction, and we invent stories about the great ancestors who must have raised its walls. We develop our own societies within its echoing halls, our own cultures, our own histories, but we have no memory of the architects. We have no access to the blueprints. We do not know the true purpose of the house itself. We only know that it is ancient, that it is our entire world, and that the knowledge of how it truly works is a secret that lies just beyond the veil of our memory. The implication extends to the very core of our being. The texts state that we were engineered, that our design was a composite, a mixture of the native clay of this planet, and the essence of the others themselves, a God who has intelligence. If this is not metaphor, what does it mean for us? It suggests that the great paradox of human nature, the simultaneous capacity for brutal animalistic behavior and for sublime transcendent thought, is not a paradox at all. It is the signature of our hybrid origin. the inevitable conflict between the two disparate sources from which we were made. The struggle within ourselves is not a moral failing. It is an engineering problem, a ghost in our own machine. The great silence, the overwhelming absence of records, begins to look less like an accident of time and more like a feature of the system. What if the erasure of the past was intentional? What if the administrators, upon concluding their direct involvement, removed the records, decommissioned the primary sites, and left their workforce with only a fragmented, mythologized memory of their own origins? Such an act would ensure that the inheritors would never fully grasp the nature of their own servitude, never be able to reconstruct the technology of their masters, and never understand the true purpose for which they were made. The silence is not an absence of memory. It is a firewall, a deliberate partitioning between the user and the source code. This reframes our entire sense of scale. The 200 years of pre-Diluvian rule recorded on the king list, once dismissed as fantasy, now stands as a quiet rebuke to our own historical arrogance. Our entire span of recorded history is but a flicker, a brief and chaotic moment in the aftermath of their long, stable reign. We are a short-lived, volatile species, living in the shadow of a history so deep that its timescale renders our own accomplishments almost insignificant. We are not at the dawn of history. We are living in its late afternoon, long after the true giants have departed the stage, leaving us to play out our dramas in the ruins they left behind. We are left, then, with a final unsettling question that arises from this synthesis. It is a question that turns our most cherished beliefs about ourselves upside down. What if civilization is not an invention? What if it is not something humanity struggled to create, slowly climbing from the darkness of ignorance? What if, instead, civilization is a memory? What if all of our art, our science, our religion, our desperate search for meaning, is not a process of invention, but a slow, painful, and often failing attempt to reconstruct a system of knowledge and a cosmic context that were once given to us whole and then taken away? The weight of this possibility settles over the archive. The dust motes dancing in the low light seem like scattered bits of a forgotten language. The silence is no longer empty. It is filled with the presence of this immense, unanswered question. The records have led us here, to the edge of a conceptual cliff. They have offered not a final truth, but a new and far more profound mystery. The path forward is not to seek a simple answer, but to learn to live with the depth of the question, to accept that our past may be infinitely stranger, and our place in the cosmos far more complex than we have ever allowed ourselves to imagine. The light in the archive has not changed. It remains a small, focused pool in a vast and surrounding darkness, illuminating the fine dust that settles on every surface, a slow, silent measure of the passing hours. The work of connection, of piecing together the scattered fragments of a single, planetary memory, is done. The maps have been put away. The lexical lists are closed. The mind, having traveled across millennia and continents, returns to this single, quiet room. The journey does not end with a destination, but with a return to the point of origin, to the object that first disturbed the silence. All the great branching implications lead back here, to a single piece of fired clay resting under glass. The air itself seems heavier now, charged with the weight of the patterns that have been observed. The silence is no longer simply an absence of sound. It has acquired a texture, a presence. It is the silence of a world that has been emptied of its architects, the profound stillness of a stage after the players have made their final exit. We are left in the audience, long after the curtain has fallen, contemplating the set pieces, the abandoned props, the faint echo of a story whose true meaning was never fully revealed to us. The archive has become a theater of memory, and its single, silent protagonist is the record of what was, and the vast, unwritten script of what was lost. And so we return to the tablet itself. It seems smaller now, more fragile, its importance measured not by the information it contains, but by the impossible journey it has completed. It is a survivor, a castaway from an age so distant it defies the grasp of our own history. To look at it is to look at a message in a bottle, a shard of a vessel that was wrecked upon the shores of a great, world-altering catastrophe. The cuneiform marks upon its surface are no longer just data. They are the scars of its survival, a testament to a truth so durable that it could withstand the fire of a collapsing city and the slow, grinding pressure of 5,000 years of earth. It offers no comfort. The story it tells is not one of divine love or human triumph. It is a story of function, of utility, of a world designed and managed for a purpose that was not our own. The hand of the scribe who pressed these wedges into the clay was not moved by poetic inspiration, but by the duty to preserve a record. He was the clerk of our own origins, and the document he left behind is not a sacred text, but a piece of administrative paperwork, the first entry in the long and complicated ledger of our servitude. To sit with this knowledge is to feel a quiet, internal shift, a reordering of the very foundations of what it means to be human. The object does not ask for belief. It simply is. It exists as a physical fact, a piece of the ancient world that has intruded upon our own. It has held its silence through the rise and fall of empires that could not read its script, through the birth of religions that told a different story, through the dawn of a scientific age that has no category for the information it holds. Its continued existence is a quiet, persistent act of defiance against our own narratives. It waits, patient and impassive, for a generation willing to read it, not for what they want it to say, but for what it actually says. The work of the archaeologist, the researcher, is an act of profound humility. It is the slow, painstaking labor of listening. It is the willingness to brush away the dust of our own assumptions and to see the object for what it is. It is to accept that the story of our past may not belong to us, that we may only be its custodians, not its authors. The hands that first unearthed this tablet from the soil of Iraq were reaching into a history that was not theirs, and the questions that arose from it are the same questions that hang in the air of this room tonight. The light seems to grow dimmer, the shadows deeper. The edge of the illuminated circle is where the known world ends, and the great, unrecorded darkness begins. We have spent this time in the light, examining the page, but the story is written in the ink of that darkness. The silence that surrounds this small artifact is not empty. It is the true text. It is the library that was burned, the tablets that were wiped clean, the history that was intentionally forgotten. The fragment in the light is only a footnote to that immense and perhaps final statement of absence. This is what remains when the text is finished. The feeling of a vast, architectural space that we can sense but cannot see. We are standing in one of its chambers, holding a single broken brick from its walls, and from this fragment we must infer the scale of the entire, invisible edifice. The history we have been examining is not the building itself, but the shadow it casts across our own, much smaller world. The presence of these others is felt most powerfully not in what they wrote, but in the sheer planet-sized scale of what they erased. The sun is now setting over the plains of what was once Sumer. The wind moves through the low, eroded mounds that hide the dust of Eridu and Uruk. It is a landscape of profound absence, a place where the ghosts of ziggurats and vast city walls are visible only to the mind. Here, under the immense, star-filled sky of the desert, the true scale of the timeline can be felt. The brief flicker of our own civilization is a small campfire in a darkness that is ancient, deep, and filled with the silent memory of a different kind of light. The questions that began this inquiry have not been answered. They have only deepened. They have expanded from the curiosity about a single, strange number to a fundamental uncertainty about our entire place in the cosmos. Who are we, if not the masters of our own world? What is history, if not the story of our own ascent? The tablets offer no final word, only a new and more profound set of questions that will echo long after the light in this room is finally extinguished. The narrator does not have the final word. The final word belongs to the silence that follows. It is a silence that invites us to remain, to keep watch. It suggests that the most important part of this journey is not the discovery of an answer, but the willingness to live within the gravity of the question itself. To understand is not the goal. The goal is to remember that we have forgotten. The inquiry does not end here. It begins here. It begins in the quiet moment after the story has been told, when the listener is left alone with the echoes. The archive is now a mirror, and the strange, ancient face we see reflected in the glass is our own. The journey was not into the past, but into the foundations of the present, into the source code of our own mysterious nature. And so we leave it here, in the suspended time of the archive, in the deep quiet of the desert night. The tablet remains, a small dark island in a sea of encroaching shadow. It holds its secrets as it has for millennia, a silent monument to a history that is too large for our memory and too strange for our myths. It is a single, cold fact in a world of stories. The story is over. The vigil continues. The silence is what remains.